In the clinic, people are describing their boss as a difficult boss, or their partner as being difficult, or maybe it's their toddler or their teen that they're having difficulties with.
The different expectations that we bring into our social situation. For one, we all have different relationship histories that inform the way that we come into new social interactions.
And then we've also got the layer of our temperament, which influences how we experience the world, how we react to information coming in from the environment.
It's easier for us to maybe connect and understand people who are similar to us than that are different.
And what research has since highlighted is that
Rachel Samson is a highly accomplished clinical psychologist with over a decade of experience working with children, adults, couples, and families. Renowned for her expertise in attachment theory and schema therapy, Rachel has trained internationally, collaborated with leading figures in the field, and contributed to groundbreaking research, clinical models, and global conferences. Dr. Jessie Stern is a developmental psychologist and researcher whose work explores close relationships, parenting, and children's social development. She's an assistant professor of psychological science at Pomona College and director of the Fan Lab. Together, Rachel and Jessie are co-authors of Beyond Difficult, an attachment-based guide to dealing with challenging people. They bring profound insight into relationships, attachment, and the science of human connection. Stay tuned. This is a conversation you won't want to miss. In your book, Beyond Difficult, I know that you were really intentional in choosing the term difficult people. Can you share why you chose that language?
I think we chose that language because it's what resonates most with people. And certainly in the clinic, people are describing their boss as a difficult boss, or their partner as being difficult, or maybe it's their toddler or their teen that they're having difficulties with. So that resonates most with people. We wanted to meet people where they are. But the title Beyond Difficult has a double meaning, where it could be that someone is beyond difficult, experiencing them as impossible. But also we're encouraging people to look beyond that label and beyond the difficult behavior to what's happening underneath.
Which I love. And I've got the book right here, actually. And even this image here, I think, just speaks to it all, really, isn't it? The overlap of the two individuals and the way that we can experience the world. We know that two people will experience the exact same situation very differently. Can you explain a little bit more about that idea of, our individual perspective and how that shapes the way that we experience interactions and obviously relationships?
Yeah, especially when it comes to that label of difficult. There can be two people who observe the same behavior, experience the same thing, and have completely different reactions to it. And part of that is the different expectations that we bring into our social situation. We'll talk about that in a bit. But for one, we all have different relationship histories that inform the way that we come into new social interactions. So if I've had a previous romantic partner who was constantly ignoring me, not responding to calls or texts, and now I'm in a new relationship where, for the most part, this person is very responsive, but there's that one time where they didn't reply to me, I'm more likely to overreact perhaps to that slight compared to somebody who is in the same situation. Or even if I describe it to my friend, oh, can you believe this person is being so difficult? They didn't reply. Maybe they don't love me. And hopefully that other person can bring some perspective and say, I don't think that this is difficult behavior. I think maybe they just missed your text this one time. So we bring our relationship history as these different lenses on behavior, but we also bring our different temperaments. So I might be more highly sensitive to somebody's behavior toward me, whereas it just rolls off the back of my best friend. And we can talk about sensitivity in more detail, but all that is to say, our perception is so subjective. And being aware of the kinds of expectations and history that we bring into relationships can really be very revealing.
It's so important. I think as a couples therapist, I'm going to ask you a question at the end, and this would be my answer. It's the one thing skill that I wish everyone had was that concept of perspective taking,
Mm.
both understanding our own filter and understanding the other person's, I think is so fundamental to understanding. And I don't know if you find this too, but people can really understand that on an intellectual level, But that felt experience, I think, sometimes is lacking until they get into a deeper understanding of what we're talking about, and which is what your book is all about, is framing that thinking and helping people to really understand themselves and each other. It can really shift our interactions and our
Mm.
relationships. You know, in the book, you talk about some of those foundations of who we are and how we experience the world. And we know obviously they start from the moment that we are born or even before that, really. Can you walk us through some of those key factors that shape the way that we show up in the world and, in particular, in relationships?
So Jessie's already touched on attachment and temperament, and then there's neurodiversity as well, or our neurobiology, which and all of those things really interplay. Our attachment experiences shape so much of our personality and our capacities and our skills. You know, development really unfolds in the context of relationships. So our early attachment relationships with key people in our life really shape so much of our sense of self, our view of other people, our view of the world, and the expectations that we have in relationships and what's going to happen in the world. And then we've also got the layer of our temperament, which influences how we experience the world, how we react to information coming in from the environment. And there's lots of ways that temperament shapes our relationships, and there's a real interplay between our attachment experiences and also that inborn temperament that we arrive into the world with, that nature and nurture. And then there's also our neurobiology or our neurotype, which we talk about in the book. And that can influence things from our sensory systems, the way that our brain processes information, our cognitive style. And going back to that idea of seeing the same situation very differently or experiencing it differently, if you're a different neurotype, if one partner's autistic and one partner's not, you might experience the world on so many levels differently. And so all of those things shape the personality that we develop into adulthood.
In the book, you introduce this concept of the double empathy problem, which I think is so helpful in sort of understanding how we view other people's behaviors and how we experience interactions and vice versa. Can you explain that concept a little more to us?
Yeah, sure. The double empathy problem came from research with autistic and non autistic people. And autistic researchers and writers developed the idea. And it's really this finding that people who are autistic find it easier to interact and empathize with other people who are autistic, and similarly, people who are not autistic find it easier to empathize with other people who are not autistic, but find it harder to empathize with people who are autistic. And there was this history of misunderstanding around autism, and that autistic folk have difficulties or deficits with empathy. And it was this really pathologizing lens that was applied to this difference before we had a broader understanding and acceptance of neurodiversity. And what research has since highlighted is that autistic folk don't have difficulties or deficits with empathy. It's with cross neurotype interactions specifically. And so the same challenges that an autistic person can be seen to have interacting and engaging with a non autistic person, we also find non autistic folk have interacting with an autistic person. So it's really this double empathy problem, if you like, where it's really about different ways of experiencing the world depending on your neurotype, and finding it easier to relate to people who have similar experiences or ways of processing the world, being in the world, than you.
Which makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? That it's easier for us to maybe connect and understand people who are similar to us than that are different. But what I really love about this is it puts the onus back on the individual, because I think we get so used to in our society othering people and sort of saying, you are different, therefore you need to adapt to the majority,
Mm.
rather than sort of seeing that difference is okay and we all have differences. And we all need to adapt and we all need to understand understand each other more deeply, which is what the book is obviously all about. Um, and I think that that shift is it's so subtle, but it's so important. And I've seen that also in I know there's some research around, you know, our capacity for empathy in terms of whether we're in a positive state or a negative state of mind. And if we're in a positive state of mind, then we're more likely to have greater empathy for our partner if they're also in a positive state of mind versus if they're in a negative state of mind. You know, it's that difference. So if we're negative, negative, that it's easy. If we're positive, positive, then it's easy. But if we're having a positive experience while our partner's having a negative experience, then we actually find it very difficult to empathize in that context.
Mm.
And I always think this is where emotion regulation comes into play. When we are more regulated, we're able to be more present with the other person's experience, and
Mm.
having regulated
Mm.
our own emotion. So reading that, it really resonated with me because I think it is about using the skills that you describe in the book to be able to come to that place where we can come in with a greater understanding and a more accepting framework for
Mm.
difference
Mm.
and seeing the positives and the strengths in
And I
that.
think that acceptance piece is key in my work, whether it's with parents and kids or whether it's with couples. There's often this resistance to what the other person is experiencing initially. And coaching around radical acceptance can be so impactful for people. This idea of it doesn't matter what the other person is perceiving or experiencing or feeling in that moment. That is reality. That is a fact. They are
Mhm.
sad in that moment. Oh, but I don't understand how they could feel sad about it. Okay, but they are feeling sad about it. That's the reality, right? And so that is it. Just when people can, break through resistance and come in with acceptance without having to agree or have the same view or the same values, but just accept radically that this is reality in this moment, things tend to improve from then.
Intellectually, I think we can all grasp that concept and go, I get it. I get that they experience it differently. But as you said, when you're supporting someone through that, it's a really difficult leap, particularly when we're in that high emotion context. But once we grasp it, and I'm sure you've experienced the same, the relationship dynamics just shift incredibly because it is this radical acceptance that happens in that moment of like, oh, okay, I can have my own valid experience that can be different from yours,
Mm.
and yours is equally valid. They're not in competition.
Mm.
They're just very different. And we can have two rights, instead of kind of fighting over who's right, who's wrong, who's interpreted the situation in the wrong way. I think that's just an enormous point where we see a huge shift in relationship dynamics.
Yeah, I love that. And it's actually easier when people get into the groove with it and it becomes their normal. Again, thinking of parents or equally partners, learning that you're not trying to change the other person's experience. If it's a
Mhm.
child, for example, having a tantrum, really distressed about something that might seem small to the adult, and they're trying to change the child's view. Come on, it's not that much of a big deal. It's just the color of a cup or a partner. It's okay that the plans have changed. It's not a big deal. We can do other things on the weekend. Trying to change the person's perspective or experience. That's a lot of
Mhm.
hard work. And as a, psychologist practicing, I can say, we can't easily change someone's experience. We don't, that's not a thing. And so when people accept that, it's actually easier for them in that interaction. You're just holding space for what the person's reality is. You're not actually trying to engineer it.
Absolutely. And I think one of the places people get caught is that intention versus impact. They feel like they're stuck because it's sort of like, well, I'm not intending for this impact to happen. And they feel like by accepting the other person's reality, it means that they're accepting that they've done something wrong.
Mhm, mhm,
And it's not about that. You can have done the most beautiful parenting or have been a completely supportive partner, and it still doesn't land the way that you intended, but the impact is still there. And I think when we can also understand that concept and grasp that concept, it helps us shift a little bit um, towards acceptance as well.
Mhm. I think one of the things that that does for the dynamic too links back to something you said, Katie, which is it helps us regulate our own emotion. The biggest
Mm,
barrier to accepting that this person is feeling a certain way or that we have some part to play is our own emotional attachment to being right or to winning in a conflict
Absolutely.
context. And just loosening that a tiny bit. Empathy ultimately is other focused. And so the biggest barrier to empathy is being self focused. And even though we don't think about it that way, so often when we're in the midst of conflict, when the emotions are high, the focus is on me being right and you being wrong, or me getting across my point of view. And that has almost never solved anything in a difficult interaction,
mhm,
right?
mhm.
That kind of competition. So if we can just soften slightly, doesn't, like you said, it doesn't mean admitting that I am to blame, but rather accepting, as Rachel said, that this is this person's point of view, then we can start to regulate our own emotions and actually get a sense of what the other person's experiencing.
Absolutely. I also love how you talk about in the book the idea of context. So we've talked a bit about, the interaction between the two people, but also how certain contexts, may not support us to operate at our best or may not support our needs, etc. You include a beautiful quote in the book: when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. And I love that because it explains so much. Can you expand on that idea, maybe in the context of highly sensitive individuals, for example, and what helps to create an environment that supports that individual's needs?
Mm. It's one of my favorite quotes, I think, ever. I just find that resonates with so many people and really fits with our approach to, the way that we view relationships and the work that we do. With highly sensitive people, they are more sensitive to their environment in a for better or worse manner. So, highly sensitive kids and adults are more sensitive to positive, supportive environments and also to negative or stressful environments. And so, when highly sensitive people are in positive, nurturing, supportive, safe environments, they can actually flourish above and beyond someone who is highly sensitive in a harsh environment, but also someone who is low on sensitivity, who's in the same positive environment. So they can actually absorb more of that good environment and benefit from it than someone who is less sensitive. But equally, on the other side, if the environment is lacking nurturing, is stressful, unsafe, harsh, then they are going to be disproportionately affected by that as well in a negative way. And so, if we see highly sensitive people who are struggling or maybe have come to therapy with mental health challenges, often it is because there has been a mismatch between their temperament and the environment, and they haven't got what they needed from the environment. And so, it's very easy to pathologize and medicalize mental distress. But this frame actually asks us to look at the context, as you said, and to look at the environment in which the flower is growing rather than the flower itself and seeing it as deficient in some way. And it makes sense when we think of this in terms of gardening. If we see a plant or a flower that's not doing well, we don't tend to say, oh, this flower's a real dud. We think, "Oh, is it in a spot where it's not getting enough sun or too much sun, or have I overwatered it,
Mm.
or did I neglect to water it, or does it need something else in the soil?" But when it comes to people, we can be quick to think, "Oh, you've got a personality disorder, or well, you've got some kind of mental disease, that's causing you to be this way."
I think that's so important because I think we can get stuck just looking at what's happening between the two individuals in interaction and forget that broader context of which may be influencing one or both really of those individuals' behaviors and experiences in that moment. I know, that can apply across we think about workplace settings where, we really sometimes set people up to fail instead of succeed, instead of being able to step back and look at their strengths and see how we can provide a context for them to work at their at their best or in schooling. Like, I think that's something I've reflected on a lot lately coming from Bali. I was just saying before, we've been living in Bali for a few years and coming back, and I have 2 children who have been in the educational environment and just all this also the social environment. It's
Mm.
so culturally different here to Bali. In Bali, it's very much, a very child-focused lens, so extremely child-focused. They just adore children, and children are just seen almost like the center of the universe, and the environment very much adapts to the child. Whereas I found coming back to Australia, we have such structures in place, which of course, there's reasons for that and they make sense, but say, for example, the school environment is very set up for children to sit still and pay attention, which we know doesn't work for some kids to be able to sit still for long periods of time, where Bali seems to have more flexibility around that and allowing more of that movement that children may require. And I've just found it really interesting reflecting on those differences and, how one environment might support, for example, highly sensitive children over another that they might find more challenging. And so you have the same child who will react completely differently in those 2 environments.
I think that's such an important point, and also that the type of environment that matters most might change with development. So
Absolutely.
for a really young child, the most salient environment that we might have the capacity to shift for the better is the environment with the caregiver. That is the number one social environment that a really young child experiences. And then once they get old enough to enter school, suddenly there's the school environment with teacher relationships and peer relationships. But then we know in adolescence, there's this really important shift that happens where your peer group and your friendships become so much more important for how development progresses from then on. So sometimes having a supportive peer group in adolescence is the environment that we really need to pay attention to as parents or as educators in order to help a young person thrive, as particularly a teen, because they're so focused on how they're being perceived by their peers. And also, the peer context can sometimes compensate for a difficult home environment in really interesting ways. So, thinking about context as being multi layered, right? But also as changing with development in terms of what's most important for a person to thrive.
Speaking of that context, so we were talking a lot about sort of the community level almost, the kind of school environment and the community context, and you touched on the peer level of interaction. Coming back to that parent level of interaction, can you explain a little bit about how, for example, a child's temperament may interact with a particular parenting style that we may see in a parent?
Yeah, I'll start, but I think Rachel will have wonderful things to say about this too. One of the things we talk about in the book is this idea of person environment fit. And similar to what Rachel was just saying, we each bring our own unique temperament to a situation. So a child who's highly sensitive is bringing that temperament into the parent child relationship. This is in their biology, it's in their genetics. And here you have a parent with a wealth of experience. Maybe they've had another child who was not highly sensitive, and they're going to start parenting a particular way. And the question is, does the child's temperament have a good or poor fit with that parent's parenting style? And sometimes it does, and sometimes there needs to be some sort of adjustment made. But one of the things we know from the research is that sensitive kids or highly reactive kids, so an infant who cries a lot, is a little bit more fussy, is more likely to react to their environment for better and for worse, like Rachel explained. They often will elicit more negative parenting behaviors, especially early on, if a parent doesn't understand that this is temperamental. So, one of the bright sides of that coin is if you can intervene with a caregiver of a highly sensitive child, there will be more positive benefit for that parent and for that child. So, the stress of a parent is more likely to go down if we're intervening with that type of parent-child dyad, and the relationship between parents and children is more likely to become secure if we can intervene early. So the beautiful thing is if we can work with a parent to kind of match a child's needs okay, this child is not responding to really firm discipline. It's making them too fearful, and then they shut down or they melt down. Let's see if we can do more empathic discipline styles, or let's see if we can try this other method of helping them feel safe and secure. That child is much more likely to benefit from those types of interventions.
I want to unpack that a little bit more because I can imagine someone's listening and they're sort of thinking, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe my child is highly sensitive. So I want to get you just to explain a little bit more about what that looks like for a parent who's starting to question if that might be their child's experience. And also when you talk about that intervention, because there's so much positive and hope in that. I think, that idea that we can have a positive impact on our children. What can that look like? What can that parent do to help support that child that is highly sensitive?
Mm. Highly sensitive kids are often described by parents as being sensitive to almost everything. So when parents look at their child in an environment and another child, their view is often that their child is reacting much more strongly to the same situations. And so there's a few key features of high sensitivity for anyone who's not familiar with the concept. There is more emotional reactivity. There tends to be a greater depth of processing information. And so, brain scan research has found that there is a deeper processing that happens for children and adults who are highly sensitive. Because there's so much coming in, it's being processed so deeply and it's registering so strongly, there's also a tendency for overstimulation. And so kids can get stressed in environments that are socially, there's a lot going on, chaotic, busy, loud. Think of, a busy market or even a shopping center. And so there's a lot going on for these kids that then mean that they're having often bigger reactions. And so there's some of the things that people will often notice. And day to day, it could be things like having difficulty with new situations. It could be feeling more impacted by other people's emotions and shifts in other people's moods or social dynamics. These kids are also able to sense subtleties more easily. So, small changes that aren't noticed by other kids, these kids tend to notice and might be affected by. Um, and there can also be a tendency for worry because there is that greater depth of processing, rumination. Sometimes there can be more anxiety, but not necessarily. And so we've got these really deeply thinking and feeling kids that are often having quite big reactions to things. Um, in terms of the parenting that can support this, it's firstly really accepting that temperament trait as a valid natural part of that child's wiring. And so we're not looking to change that. In fact, you can't bypass a child's neurobiology or their temperament. That is a fundamental part of how they're wired. And so coming at it with acceptance is hugely beneficial for these kids because they are so perceptive and so sensitive. If parents are even subtly trying to change them, don't be so sensitive or come on, be brave, you can do it. Look, your sister's doing it, or look, your friends are jumping in the pool. They can very early internalize that this sensitivity is something that is not desirable, and that can then influence the development of their self-esteem. So acceptance is really key. And then we also want parents to be really sensitive and responsive to their children's needs. And so that might be a need for comfort, it might be a need for space, it might be extra support when they're trying something new. Um, but it's also a sensitivity around the child's feelings and being really accepting and validating and nurturing of their feelings. So sometimes if parents come into parenting not having had a high nurture relationship growing up, it can feel a little bit foreign for them to now have this, deeply feeling reactive child with all of these feelings. And sometimes parents don't feel like they've got the skills to respond. And so sometimes, coaching, seeing a therapist, reading books will help give parents the language and the tools to be able to respond in a more nurturing way to their kids. It's also often the case that parents themselves are highly sensitive, that they are very comfortable with nurture and very secure in themselves, but there is this often dominant idea that children need to be less sensitive in order to be resilient. And so then parents
Mm.
feel this societal pressure to not coddle, even though their instinct and natural inclination is actually to offer that nurture. So, generally, being more accepting, being sensitive, responsive, and nurturing is the kind of environment that we want to foster for these kids.
Absolutely. And I would add to that, for if a parent is, if this is resonating for them, is to follow your Instagram because I think a lot of your content focuses on this. And it's really important, as you said, because it's not just about, even if we are naturally feeling like, oh, this is how I should respond, I think we can get so caught up in the noise of society and what people are telling us that we should do, or other parents sort of saying, oh, your child should be doing this or should behaving in this way, that we start to adapt our behavior, even though it doesn't feel right, even though it doesn't feel instinctive. So I think being exposed to content like you share on Instagram is really helpful because it actually helps parents to tune back into, yes, okay, like trusting myself, which we would hope all parents would just naturally trust their instincts. But we can get really caught in that noise. So I think being able to, have that kind of content in your feed is really important and reassuring. This conversation was so interesting and there was simply too much to unpack in one episode, so we kept the conversation going. Look out for part 2 coming next week. Subscribe for more conversations filled with new insights, inspiration, and practical tools to create a life you love.